the Carter Center, specifically on data analysis project supporting our Syria work. I'm joined here with our data analyst, Evan, and our researcher, Hari, and we're looking forward to discussing with you how we've applied open source data to estimate unexploded ordnance presence in Syria. Since the outbreak of the armed conflict in Syria in 2011, explosive weapons have been deployed extensively by all parties. This includes missiles, rockets, barrel bombs, artillery shells, as well as landmines. Due to a variety of factors, a proportion of these either they fail to detonate and they remain unexploded ordnance. These explosive remnants of war can pose an enduring threat to a population long after the violence has stopped. They have a resounding impact on civilian life, economic activity, environmental health, making them a crucial and demanding, a crucial issue demanding attention from the international community. According to UN OCHA in 2020, there were an average of 76 unexploded accidents per day in Syria, and 1 in 2 people are at risk for explosive contamination, meaning that for many civilians, the war is far from over. Any reconstruction and stabilization efforts in Syria will be highly reliant upon the clearance of UXO, which itself is relying upon knowledge where demining should focus. In usual peacetime situations, on-the-ground assessments, surveys and clearance operations are the most effective ways to deal with the physical threat of UXO. But in the Syrian context, this can be challenging due to political and security constraints in many parts of the country. Given these restraints, humanitarian mine organizations turn to desk-based studies to prepare for future activities while they wait for conditions on the ground to improve. One such method for accomplishing this is to draw from big data on conflict events to infer the locations and concentrations of potential explosive munition contamination. The Carter Center has been monitoring the Syrian conflict since its onset. We've collected data on conflict events from open source using local news agencies, social media outlets, and in 2018 from ACLED. This open source approach has enabled us to maintain one of the longest, most granular data set on the Syrian conflict, documenting more than 180,000 conflict events. So leveraging this data set, we were able to collect and adapt a methodology to assess the likely concentration of UXOs sourced from conflict events across Syria dating back to 2012. Previous studies have focused on mapping the number of conflict events. Our methodology counts the number of explosive munitions used per conflict event to provide a more accurate depiction of potential contamination levels of explosive munitions. This result is a quantitative and geographic analysis that can be used to inform recovery efforts as well as negotiations around these issues writ large. And now I will turn to our data analyst, Evan, to discuss our methodology.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for joining you guys in the room and everyone online. And so over the next couple of slides, mainly I'll talk about the methodology that we use and how we turn conflict events into something that we can use to estimate unexploded ordnance across the country of Syria. This is something that I think also, it really helps us that it's a relatively simple model to explain. And when we're working with deminers, that's also really important too, because when we're talking about improvements, something that we keep in mind a lot is this explainable? Is it something that we can work with people on the ground with, and that makes sense to a group of people, because that also affects, you know, the way in which they're able to pick it up and use it within their day-to-day activities. So you can see in the top visual, there's the ACLED input event. So when this data comes in, that's oftentimes what the notes column looks like, which is what we use. And the airstrikes, mortar shelling, and armed clashes, these are all rolled up into one event. And it's really important for us to gather those as individual events or individual incident types. And as you can see, we've crossed out classes on the bottom because those are often using light weaponry or things that don't revolve in explosive munition use. And we'll split the air bombardment and shelling into 2 different categories, and that munitions type is really kind of a propulsion type, whereas we also do more granular about, you know, the exact explosive used. So really, it's just about getting as much granularity as possible out of each one of these events, and then ensuring that we're capturing the right types of munitions used. And the next major step that we take is getting a count. So for each one of these events, wherever available in the notes from ACLID, we'll pull the number out. Before we were gathering this data directly ourselves from Twitter and into other sources like that, or newspapers, and verifying as much as we can always every event that we put into our data set. So at times we can grab it straight from those sources. Other times it's not available, and we'll input that munition count basically from like an average of that category. So it's the best effort that we have right now in getting an overall count. And honestly, it's the numbers are a little bit smaller, and because we don't want to really like inflate that. So I'm forgetting the exact word, but it's I don't want to say humble. It's a small amount. It's a smaller amount that we estimate there. Anyways, this city right here is Raqqa. It's the 6th largest city in Syria. Its population as of 2021 is about 500,000 people. And each one of those small little red dots that you can see on the screen, there's some out on the countryside to the right as well that might be harder to see. But each one of these are the locations that we've estimated for explosive munitions use. So they're often centered towards a point of reference or a neighborhood, and these are not exact points. So the data comes in a matter that we can look at from videos and things like that, like more or less where it happens, and we can use those numbers as estimates. But what we're definitely not saying is that on this corner you'll find a landmine, or on this corner you'll find an unexploded mortar shell sticking out of the rubble. Realistically, it's something that when we share with deminers, they'll go on the ground regardless and perform these surveys themselves. And so that's where they'll really able to get the granular idea about where exactly this is, so they could later send back in clearance teams and dispose of those unexploded ordnance. So additionally on that topic, I want to say in terms of these points, they're also primarily utilized as a prioritization. So when we're looking at the number of munitions and the locations of the munitions, what they really best serve as is for deminers to get an understanding of where these munitions might lie, the population that they're affecting, and also you can compare that with population centers or infrastructure, and then use that as a tool to prioritize different locations. So this is the first step in one of the ways that we can visualize this data and make it available for people to look at a map of Syria and get an understanding of the concentration across the entire country. So each one of those little icons at the center of these little towns that you can see are UN OCHA source data points. So that's from populated places. And we've also added in some of our own where necessary. And that gives us around 8,099 individual population centers, towns, villages, et cetera, across Syria. And these yellow lines that we see here are drawn exactly halfway between one town and another. So what this grid of yellow polygons is called is it's a Voronoi diagram. And realistically, that just helps us draw around any population center an area with which we can then say these munitions fell within a certain distance of this town, or closer to this town than to any other town. And when you blow that up on a map, this is what we get. And each one of these polygons, we've also aggregated to each of these polygons the number of munitions that we've been able to record. So the darker red ones up in the northwest towards Aleppo and Idlib, that represents a much more dense UXO area for what we've been able to estimate. And the way we do that is we'll take the number of munitions with a polygon, we'll divide it by the number of kilometers within that area, so kilometers squared. So basically just getting a density estimation per area, how much UXO we believe to be in one area. And then one major piece of this as well is that since we're not saying that any one of these locations or places that we've observed online through verified events, we're not saying that they always result in unexploded ordnance. Like right now, we're using between a 10 to 30% failure rate for any munitions that have been fired in Syria to remain in the ground or remain in populated centers or in agricultural fields as unexploded ordnance. What we're seeing now, newer munitions that are being tested, and on the test grounds, it's often a lot lower of a number, sometimes 2%. Realistically, the weapons that we're using here, it's in much different circumstances, much different terrain, which affects whether or not the munition goes off as expected. And also these munitions are often much older for conflicts that were much before the time that we're living in now. So realistically, that just means that the munitions less often explode upon impacts and leave a longer lasting legacy within a country. So that's kind of the overall methodology about how we understand where our unexploded ordnance may lie within the country of Syria. And since gathering data from 2012 and sourcing more recently data from ACLID, we've gathered just south of the number of 1 million explosive munitions used across the country of Syria. And if you apply that 10 to 30% failure rate, that means that there's somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 unexploded ordnance within the country of Syria, so affecting daily lives of its civilians. But that's all I have for now. So Annie, I'll pass it back to you to talk about how we use that.
So after the Mozambique Civil War ended in 1992, demining experts needed 23 years to clear 86,000 unexploded weapons left behind. This study suggests that there could be more than 3 times that amount of UXO in Syria where demining efforts have yet to begin. In recent years, major efforts have been made to clear unexploded munitions, but clearance operations have been limited due to the ongoing conflict. There's a significant concentration of UXO that's along front lines, and up to a quarter of all munitions used throughout the conflict are located along front lines. And these are largely inaccessible to demining organizations due to the ongoing conflict. So the scale of problem of UXO in Syria is so big that there's no way one actor could address it unilaterally. And demining efforts require multiple logistical inputs, import of necessary equipment, foreign local expertise, as well as coordination on mapping missions and UXO discoveries. So one approach the center has proposed is to build multi-party cross-line collaboration and use UXO as an incentive for conflicting parties to give brief and coordinated security assurances and to allow for the removal of UXO from civilian areas along front lines. Drawing from our comprehensive data set, we can identify and prioritize communities for clearance operations by examining the relationship between recorded explosive munitions use and current conflict levels. The map to my left over there shows the level of fighting in frontline communities in northwest Syria during 2022. Each point represents a community with the size and color corresponding to the number of recorded conflict events for that year. As you can see, while significant conflict remains, there are also some notable areas of relative peace along present-day front lines, with the smallest points representing only 1 to 12 events per year during that year. So these zones of relative calm along the front lines provide an opportunity for explosive clearance operations. Pairs of adjacent communities can be identified and brought together to coordinate on clearance efforts. We can identify these communities by filtering for population centers within 10 kilometers of front lines and then running a k-means clustering algorithm for each population center based on the number of conflict events and expected UXO contamination. We are then able to categorize them, as you can see on the scatter plot, into 3 categories: communities with low levels of ongoing conflict, moderate level of contamination, low levels of conflict, high level contamination, and then high levels of conflict, high level contamination. This coordination across fragmented geographies and policies would encourage much needed dialogue between conflicted parties and could potentially help address the current trust deficit and help lay the groundwork for further agreements in Syria. So, to conclude, include the presence of UXO as a critical impediment to Syria's recovery and development, impacting ability to farm, use roads, repair housing, and re-enter buildings such as schools and hospitals. Explosive munition contamination is likely to affect multiple generations of Syrians. These weapons need to be cleared to safeguard civilians and encourage economic and development and recovery. At the local level, demining can help the social and economic empowerment of local communities and assist in post-conflict reconciliation. This data-driven open source approach allows for analysts and mine action organizations to estimate UXO contamination down to the community level, and it provides operational planners guidance for tracking, locating, and prioritizing demining efforts, especially with directing finer on-the-ground surveys and assessments and risk education programs. Additionally, advancing demining is an interest to all parties, and while challenging, it can serve as a unique opportunity for international and local actors to work together towards a less contentious and common goal. So the center has released 5 non-technical studies examining the distribution of explosive weapons used in Syria between 2012 and 2021. We are currently engaging with demining groups in Syria to understand their priorities, share our data, as well as solicit feedback to make sure our data suits their needs. We are also working with partner academics to externally validate our method and compare it with on-the-ground survey data, in hopes to provide a more accurate outline of UXO concentration across Syria and create a methodology that could be replicated in other contexts. Thank you for listening in, and look forward to answering your questions.
One little question. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. This was an example of Syria, right? I came late, maybe you introduced your center, but is there any chance you have the project like similar data for in other countries? For example, Georgia. I'm originally from Georgia, and if there is none, we would love to somehow get closer to see if other countries can have such great data, which is very important. And the second question is that, for example, we are here in USA, right? And you might be interested what's going on in Syria, in other countries, how we can access to these data as an informational resource, something like that.
In terms of the first question, the reason why we were able to do this is because we were collecting conflict events since the conflict started in 2012. And we didn't realize up until 2019 through consultations and workshops that humanitarians were coming to us needing our data, but also realizing, oh, wait, you have this whole data set on munitions use. Could we then lay that out? You are able, and what we're trying to do is if you have this conflict event data set, we can hopefully apply this methodology, and it's, as Evan explained, very simple methodology to be able to replicate in other contexts. At the Carter Center, we are currently, I know we do have data on Mali, as well as Sudan. And we actually in Mali, the thing in Mali that we have that we didn't have in Syria is we have underground resources. In Syria at the time, I believe we had multiple organizations helping us report on the ground. But yes, so we don't have any data on Georgia specifically, but I'm sure you'll be able to potentially find that.
And also just to point out that along with the biotechnical studies that we publish, we also publish a paper detailing our methodology.
Yes.
So that way anyone who wants to, so we can send the paper along to anyone's interested, but that way for anyone who, like, say if you plug data for Georgia or for any other context that you guys can apply yourself, because.
Or maybe we can get in touch with you for expertise and for your knowledge to how to.
And our data is fully accessible. We share it with whoever wants it, needs it, researchers, humanitarians. We totally believe in sharing as much. And there's a community of, we see a community of not sharing, especially honestly trying to have deminers share their data. What we realize is sometimes they're too afraid to share it because of how it's been collected. It's not organized or anything of that sort. But at the end of the day, we're trying to create a culture of sharing. We've always just been, hey, this is our method. This is our data, and whoever needs it should be able to use it.
This is very Nice, thank you.
In terms of like rolling over to other region, like in addition to your question, so can you elaborate more, like which part was automated and which part was more manual? So like you mentioned that the data, text-driven instance data, I imagine, or has been collected throughout this like decades automatically. And then when it comes to the analysis of like, is that like explosions, is that a landmine, depending on the kind of like a text analysis, you are assigning the number of munitions. And then you created this data visualization, like throughout this process, which part was automated, which part was manual, and which part can be kind of like a pain point to further roll over if the point of like a data collection is taken care of.
Can I?
If I can add to that, but my question goes in a similar direction. How do you move from the left side, the accurate text input, to the dot that you showed us on the map? Like, do you count there was 50 artillery shells launched? Is that 50 dots or that's one dot? Do you take into account into which direction it was? What type of manufacturer maybe it was, so they have a different percentage of not going off? Like,
These are really good
from the
questions.
left side to the right side.
Yeah, so I'll try to start here. Gathering data from 2012 to 2018 was much like ACLA does it now, in the sense that it's all manually sourcing through consistent newspapers that are reporting on the conflicts, identifying reliable Twitter accounts, and then fact-checking them using OSINT principles. And so all of that data that we gathered, extremely manual, and every event that we gathered was double checked. So now we're lucky enough that we have a reliable source such as ACLA that we can use. And that's something also that makes it really replicable for other conflicts as well. So now that we have a system of doing it within one country, as they mentioned before, they really, once you know one country or one ACLA data set, you know them all. So it's something that we can definitely replicate within other countries. In terms of splitting these ACLA input events, because yeah, we do look through the notes, because within one event, there's multiple types of events that we care about. And so we did that for a long time in-house. We've hired contractors to help us with that now to do it personally. One thing that we're working on right now, we've had work in the past with Microsoft. They have an AI for Good arm, and they set up what was an NLP model, BERT for anyone that cares about those things, to read through these and basically say there's a 90% probability that airstrikes was one of the events in these notes. And then so basically what that does, instead of us having to go through and snag air bombardment and shelling from the notes, then the computer does that, and we can review lower probability events ourselves. So just shrinking the amount of work we're doing. That's something that we're in talks with again, and we're trying to basically get them to, in partnership with them, to work on a GPT model, which we think will have a much higher success rate, and therefore make us look over less events and things like that. So that's one area that we're looking to automate more. And in terms of the numbers, that's also wherever available. Our contractors who are doing this right now, they'll grab those events from the notes and input that. So then we'll basically have a column that says, is this an estimate, yes or no? And if it was an estimate, aka we didn't see a number, then we use the averages, and that's I don't want to say automation, but it's really easy to do. And in terms of munition types or manufacturers and things like that, that's something we're not, ACLA doesn't probably have the time or ability to get that information from news sources. Earlier on in the conflict, that was something that I think was probably more possible based on the amount of video content that we were getting, something that we haven't gathered on. And we've been really that's like, in terms of improving our model, that's one of the #1 things, and that we're talking about. How can we do different things to input that numbers? Because also the number of munitions that we get, for anyone who's looked at ACLA data, And for people who have like manually input those events, it's only 20% of the time that we actually know the numbers. And so that's why right now we're using something like and just an average. Had we had more numbers available, that's something that we could more likely, I think the principle is generally like 5 to 10% maximum, where you want to impute numbers based on other, numbers that you're seeing. So had we had more information available there, that's one of the first things we would have done. But that's one of the things we're really thinking about, like how can we make that failure rate better? Because there's parts, in different parts of Syria that different governments are using their explosive munitions, therefore manufactured by different groups and manufactured at different years. And so it's very different. So that's a really good question.
I think we had a question from online.
Did you see one? Oh, no, I didn't see.
If there is no question.
Oh, yes, I see here. I pulled up the question online for you.
Okay, after that.
And then if you want to ask your question first, or?
No, it's okay, after that. Can I ask now or somebody will?
Yeah, go for it. There's one online, which I think we'll get to in a second, on the right, but sorry, Jae-Hyun, we're gonna go in room for this one.
I mean, I think we can simply answer
Oh,
that.
okay.
Says, I understand data was collected, but what the overall timeline looks like with the study we've done over 2019, I would imagine something that takes long. Yeah, I mean, when we started collecting this data, the intention was not to map the concentration of unexploded ordnance, but I think you can speak a bit more on the timeline of it.
Mm-hmm.
Publishing this too late? No, not at all. I think it was in 2019 when we started saying, okay, hey, we actually have all this data. We can help humanitarians through our workshops. They were asking us for this, and they're like, hey, do you have munitions count, or like what type of explosive were used? Like, okay, this could be something that we could use. So honestly, we're seeing actually more relevancy of it now. We are seeing a lot of people use this method in Ukraine. So I would say it's still, in terms of what you collect, I mean, any conflict event data that you collect will always be relevant to look at different trends over time. If you don't have anything else to that. How are you?
I was going to say, unfortunately, even though we know there's been clearance operation in, like, say, Northeast Syria, because there's a lot of US stuff there, unfortunately, a lot of stuff we have is still relevant because a lot of the places where explosive munitions are remaining, people have not been able to go to it all. So even like in Northeast Syria, like the amount of areas like all these demining groups have done is actually really, really small. So much of Northeast Syria still has not been like properly explored. So
even government areas as well, due to sanctions, you can't import necessary equipment into there. So government, like Southern Syria, for instance, nobody's touched yet. A lot of funding's only gone to Northwest Syria. Again, political. Actually, deminers in Syria are having a hard time getting funding for Syria because all of it is now going into Ukraine. So yeah, the thing is like the one thing that you would need to kind of think about is when you collect data from 2012, what we're seeing is sometimes people end up using it, moving it. You say something fell in 2012 somewhere, it may no longer be there, but that's something you have to account for because people are just literally moving them and then putting them in water wells, unfortunately, which then is contaminating water. So that's just something that we can't control for, but you just keep in mind.
Yeah, and then just one last point. How many years did they take to
23 years
in Mozambique?
Yeah, they will never ever demine. You'll never demine a whole place. I mean, there are still a lot of countries that still have unexploded ordnance. It's just way too expensive, takes a lot of time. 23 years for 86,000. I think there was an estimate of like 750 years to get everything from to demine Ukraine. Something, and it's still probably, and you'll never ever be able to demine. However, what we can do is prioritize which areas and cities to go into.
Yeah.
also worth pointing out, even Germany still has World War II bombs that are fine. But
That's correct.
at least it can make a small effort to making things livable for people.
With this funding perspectives, like a budget, how is it covered? Because it can be a lot of expenses collecting all that and create great final product. So who is responsible for paying that? How to get funds for this one? if you have any.
The Carter Center has graciously been, we are a nonprofit, so we do work on funding. The funding landscape has changed a lot, I think, over the past 2 years. So we have not secured funding in about two years or so, but prior to that, we were working with the McGovern, as well as GIZ, and who else?
For example, in country Georgia, there is a lot of donor organizations who might be good donors to give more funds for this project, right? For the same can be in Ukraine, because GTZ, it's UNDP, GTZ, these organizations, they are in Georgia. So, for example, if we take Georgia's example, and Ukraine will have a lot of support with funding. So I think this would be also great.
I mean, that's definitely something that like we can talk about as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of Syria, we've been able to find a good niche where we have such good data and where we've been able to use it and share it with different demining organizations. Ukraine, there's so much money and so many groups going in there. So that's something that had there been the need, or if there is the need and there's the funding for it, we definitely consider, as well as Georgia, because realistically, this is something that we've developed within Syria because
We had the data.
we had the data and it's just something that we've been able to make here. But one of our next steps is trying to see how can we use this other places,
Yeah,
basically.
we'll be working with several professors to externally validate this method, because our hope is we want this to be applied into other contexts, especially when you're preparing for clearance operations. It's really helpful to have these desk-based studies to help you prioritize areas for surveying.
Just gonna flag that we're at time.
Okay.
We have to move on to the second presentation, but I know if you want to do any closing remarks.
I'll just say quickly, if you guys have any questions, kind of way to wrap up. We're around for the next couple of days, so happy to talk.
So questions for after, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe we have to go, but
Okay.
we can talk in the hallway.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, good.
Yeah.